Medieval battles were fought with swords, spears, bows, and sometimes only with bare hands and teeth. Armies were made up of various troop types from different social classes, all united under one banner. And despite some common misconceptions, most medieval battles weren't fought in neat rows, but rather in complete chaos. So what was a battle in the Middle Ages really like? Let's start with the setup before the battle even began. Raising an army in the Middle Ages was a massive task. Depending on the kingdom, armies could be raised through feudal levies, where lords were required to supply a certain number of armed men in exchange for their service. These men could be supplemented by mercenaries, soldiers who fought for money, and conscripts, those who were basically forced into military service. Once an army was assembled, they needed to be fed. Food was usually supplied by local communities through taxes or by the nobility who led the army. Water had to be carried by pack animals or collected from natural sources. While encamped, soldiers would live in tents or other rudimentary shelters and try to maintain some semblance of order. Getting to the battlefield was often a long trek, sometimes taking days or even weeks. Armies traveled in a huge convoy that included not only soldiers, but also support staff, supply wagons, and livestock. When the time came to fight, troops would deploy in various formations depending on the terrain and the enemy. Some common tactics included the shield wall, a defensive formation used by infantry, usually in response to cavalry charges. Cavalry charges themselves were common, especially in the early stages of a battle. Pincer movements, where troops would attack from two sides, were also popular. Armies would also take advantage of any natural features on the battlefield, such as fighting on a hill to get a better vantage point or using forests for cover. Often, though, battles were fought in open fields with both sides trying to outmaneuver and defeat each other. So who was fighting, and what were they wearing? Battles in the Middle Ages were fought between organized teams of combatants. You had knights, mounted fighters who were usually higher on the societal rungs, and were known for wearing heavy armor. Men-at-arms, who were unmounted fighters who wore similar armor to knights, but were generally lower on the social scale. Archers, who were good for ranged attacks, but vulnerable in close combat. Infantry, the main force in most armies, who fought with a variety of weapons and armor. Crossbowmen, who were similar to archers, but used a mechanical device to launch bolts. And finally, you had siege warfare specialists, who were skilled in the art of taking castles and other fortifications. In terms of what they wore, soldiers in the Middle Ages wore mail, a type of armor made of interlocking metal rings. Plate armor, which was made of large metal plates and was the most common type of armor worn by knights and men-at-arms. Leather armor, which was cheaper and lighter than mail, but not as protective. And lastly, some soldiers wore no armor at all. Weapons were just as diverse, with swords being the most common, followed by spears and polearms, axes and bows. Siege warfare also had its own set of weapons, including trebuchets, battering rams and siege towers, and don't forget about the colorful banners and heraldry that helped troops identify each other in the heat of the battle. Speaking of heat, let's talk about the chaos of combat itself. The first contact between the two armies was often marked by a shock and a cacophony of noise. Trumpets blared, drums pounded, and men roared as the two sides prepared to clash. As the battle began, soldiers engaged in hand-to-hand fighting, often in cramped and violent conditions. The clash of steel on steel echoed across the battlefield as swords and spears met in deadly embrace. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, blood, and manure. As men fought to protect their king and their honor, exhaustion was a constant companion, and even the most seasoned veterans felt the weight of fatigue as the battle raged on. Fear was a potent force on the battlefield, driving men to both great acts of bravery and unspeakable acts of cowardice. The deafening roar of battle, the sickening thud of bodies hitting the ground, the haunting cries of the wounded, all contributed to a symphony of terror that could shake a man's soul. Amidst the chaos, adrenaline surged through the veins of the fighters, lending them superhuman strength and a heightened awareness. It was a potent cocktail of fear and excitement that pushed them to fight harder, move faster, and endure more. But amidst the flurry of activity, there were moments of clarity. A knight might pause in the midst of combat to adjust his helmet. An archer might take a deep breath before releasing an arrow. A soldier might steady his spear before charging into the fray. These moments of mindfulness offered a brief respite from the overwhelming chaos. A chance to collect oneself before plunging back into the maelstrom of battle. As the battle reached its climax, the fate of the combatants hung in the balance. Some were injured and left to the mercy of their comrades, or the unforgiving terrain. Others were captured, becoming prisoners of war and bargaining chips for ransom. And still others met their end on the battlefield, their lives cut short by the brutality of medieval warfare. For those who survived, the aftermath of battle brought its own set of challenges. Medical care for the wounded was often rudimentary at best, leaving many to suffer from their injuries or succumb to infection. Capture meant a whole host of problems, from the risk of execution to the uncertainty of when or if one might be ransomed back to freedom. Ultimately, the outcome of a battle could mean the difference between glory and infamy, victory and defeat, life and death. On the side of victory, celebrations erupted, the victors reveling in their triumph and preparing for whatever came next. On the other side, the defeated retreated, hoping to regroup and redeem themselves another day. Either way, the aftermath of battle was a time of reflection, of assessing the cost of victory or the pain of defeat. It was a moment to remember those who fell, to honor their sacrifice, and to mourn their passing. In the grand tapestry of medieval life, battles were not just events, they were turning points, shaping not just the course of history, but the very fabric of society.